She was watching someone she had actually known, someone who had welcomed her into family conversations, someone who had once offered her advice that, at the time, seemed almost insignificant. And that's why her recent comments have she continued making headlines, sometimes for charitable work and public appearances, but just as often for controversies that kept drawing media attention. Each new story seemed to add another layer to an already complicated public image, and gradually, the cheerful, approachable Duchess many people remembered attracted so much attention. Speaking openly about Sarah years later, Ruthie admitted that she found what had emerged about the former Duchess deeply disappointing. She explained that Sarah had always been kind to her personally, making it even harder to reconcile those positive memories with the stories that later dominated public discussion. Became overshadowed by constant scrutiny. For most people, those headlines were simply another chapter in the never-ending story of the royal family. But for Ruthie, they carried a different weight. Unlike millions of readers, she wasn't watching a stranger's reputation unfold. And there was no reason for anyone else to question them. They were simply part of a private conversation between two women whose lives briefly crossed inside one of the world's most famous families. Then life moved on. Prince Edward and Ruthie eventually ended their relationship. The positive memories she has of Sarah. Even while explaining why she no longer keeps in touch with her, she has continued to describe Sarah as someone who welcomed her warmly during those early years. That's an important detail because it reminds words don't sound nearly as ordinary as they once did. Not because anyone has uncovered new evidence explaining them, but because time has changed the way people hear them. That's what makes this story so compelling. When Sarah Ferguson reportedly said those words, there was no public debate about what they meant. Ruthie didn't present them as a dramatic warning. Sarah Ferguson's own journey continued, bringing moments of public success alongside periods of intense scrutiny. Years passed, headlines came and went, and what once seemed like an ordinary remark slowly became something people wanted to understand. But here's what's interesting. Ruthie has never tried to erase other. That distinction is important because it shows this isn't a story about old grudges. It's about how new information can reshape old memories. Think about that for a moment. Rather than attacking Sarah as a person, Ruthie expressed genuine sadness that someone she once respected had become associated with so much controversy. She also revealed something else that surprised many royal watchers. Despite once sharing a friendly relationship, Ruthie confirmed that they are no longer in contact. It wasn't how often do we look back at something someone said years earlier and suddenly hear it differently because of everything that's happened since. A sentence that once seemed ordinary can take on an entirely new meaning when viewed through the lens of later events. That's exactly what appears to have happened here. Sarah's reported advice, "Get out while you can," didn't be presented as the result of an argument or personal falling out. Instead, she suggested that the developments surrounding Sarah in recent years had changed how she viewed the relationship altogether. Makes sense with the benefit of hindsight. The truth is, no one can say for certain. Sarah herself has never publicly explained what she meant, and Ruthie hasn't claimed to know exactly what was going through Sarah's mind either. Yet that's precisely what makes this story so fascinating. One short sentence, remembered decades later, has reopened a conversation that many believed had long been forgotten. And as we'll soon discover, that wasn't the only reason Ruthie eventually began seeing Sarah Ferguson in a completely different light. Ruthie saw a side of royal life few outsiders ever witnessed. What secrets did those private moments reveal? How deep was her connection to the palace? And what discovery would challenge everything she thought she knew next as events begin unfolding? Let's unravel the mystery. Inside Edward's Circle. Now, this is where the story gets even more interesting. Before Ruthie Henshall became known as Prince Edward's former girlfriend, she was simply a successful West End performer who unexpectedly found herself stepping into one of the world's most closely watched families. Their relationship lasted for around 5 years, and during that time, felt experiences inside royal life? Or was there another reason those words stayed with Ruthie for so many years? The deeper we look into Sarah Ferguson's story, the more complicated that simple sentence becomes. Behind Sarah's words lies a deeper mystery. Was her advice a simple looking at Sarah Ferguson's reported words through Ruthie Henshall's eyes? But what if those few words weren't really about Ruthie at all? What if they reflected Sarah's own experience of royal life? That's a question no one can answer with certainty. Sarah has never publicly explained exactly what she meant by saying become remarkable because the words changed. They became remarkable because the circumstances around them changed. The more Ruthie reflected on Sarah's public journey, the harder it became to dismiss that comment as nothing more than a passing joke. But here's the question that still hasn't been answered. Was Sarah speaking about her own reflection of royal struggles, or a hidden glimpse into pressures behind palace walls? What did she truly understand about life inside the monarchy? And what revelations could change everything we thought we knew? Stay with us. Looking back differently. Now this is where the story becomes much bigger than one conversation. Up to this point, we've been against public scrutiny. Each new headline seemed to shape public opinion a little more, until many people no longer remembered the lively, approachable figure who had once been welcomed into the royal family with so much optimism. For someone like Ruthie, that transformation couldn't have. Ruthie hasn't denied the kindness she experienced firsthand. Instead, she's drawn a clear line between the Sarah she knew personally and the Sarah who later became the focus of repeated public controversy. That's an important distinction because it reminds us that personal experiences and public reputations don't always tell the same story. Over the years, Sarah Ferguson's name appeared in headlines for a wide range of reasons. Some stories focused on her charitable work and efforts to rebuild her life after leaving full-time royal duties. Others centered on financial difficulties, media criticism, and associations that attracted an incredibly intimidating time in her life. Dating Prince Edward meant stepping into an unfamiliar world where every interaction mattered. And according to Ruthie, Sarah helped make that transition easier. Those memories haven't disappeared. Even now, what exactly happened between those early royal days and the person she eventually came to see? That's the question that leads us to the next chapter, where we explore why Ruthie chose to speak about all of this now, after so many years of silence. Decades later, why are Sarah's forgotten words suddenly echoing through royal conversations again? What changed behind the scenes to bring these old reflections back into focus? And could her candid revelations uncover a deeper story the public never expected to revisit as this mystery unfolds? Why speak now? Now here's the question that has kept this story alive. If Ruthie Henshall has carried royal headlines, she isn't asking people to ignore Sarah's controversies, nor is she pretending her own positive experiences never happened. Instead, she's acknowledging both sides of the story. She remembers Sarah as someone who welcomed her with kindness, but she also admits that later events changed how she viewed that friendship. And perhaps that's what makes Sarah's reported warning even more intriguing today. If Ruthie still remembers the warmth, yet no longer shares the same admiration, what is simply about marrying a prince? A casual comment could be analyzed endlessly. Even moments meant to be private often became subjects of public debate. It's a level of scrutiny that very few people ever experience. And for someone who had entered royal life with an outgoing and spontaneous personality, adapting to those expectations wasn't always easy. Formal style didn't always fit the traditions of the monarchy. Whether those criticisms were fair or not, they created enormous pressure that followed Sarah throughout much of her royal life. Now think back to Ruthie. She wasn't a royal, but she was dating Prince Edward and spending time around the family. She was beginning to understand the unique environment. Get out while you can. But when you look at the life she was living at the time, it's not difficult to understand why people are revisiting that moment today. Sarah had already experienced firsthand how demanding life inside the monarchy could be. Becoming part of the royal family wasn't. That's one reason Sarah Ferguson attracted so much attention. Supporters often described her as approachable, energetic, and refreshingly natural. Critics, however, sometimes viewed those same qualities very differently, arguing that her sound quite as harmless as it once did. Was Sarah simply talking about the relentless pressure that comes with royal life? Was she speaking from her own difficult experiences inside the monarchy? Or was there another reason behind those words that only make... Instead of criticizing Sarah's personality, Ruthie made it clear that her opinion shifted because of later developments that she found deeply troubling. Suddenly, that old comment, "Get out while you can," doesn't get so much attention. So, what changed? That's the question people have been asking since Ruthie admitted she no longer keeps in touch with Sarah and openly expressed disappointment over what has come to light about her in recent years. With members of the royal family, Sarah reportedly drew her into conversations and made sure she never felt like an outsider. That isn't the image many people associate with Sarah Ferguson today, and it's exactly why Ruthie's reflections have attracted. We're back where this story began, with one simple sentence that refuses to fade away. Get out while you can. On the surface, it's only 5 words. But after hearing Ruthie Henshall reflect on her years around the royal family, their story, and what final meaning emerges when the past is finally revisited? Stay tuned. The words remain. All right, so after everything we've explored, we're about life inside the monarchy. But perhaps the biggest reason this story continues to resonate is that it doesn't offer an easy conclusion. Instead, it leaves us with a lingering mystery about private conversations, public reputations, and the way hindsight reshapes even our clearest memories. And that brings us to the final chapter, where we return to the sentence that started it all and ask whether its true meaning was ever understood in the first place. The warning behind those words carries a different weight as memories collide with unexpected revelations. Did Sarah's advice hide a deeper truth? Could Ruthie's experience change how we see the entire? This isn't a story built on bitterness. Instead, it's built on contrast. On one side is Sarah, Ruthie remembers personally, a woman who was friendly, inclusive, and kind enough to make someone dating Prince Edward feel comfortable within unfamiliar surroundings. On the other side is the public figure whose later controversies left Ruthie openly admitting that she felt disappointed by what had emerged over the years. Those two versions don't necessarily cancel each other out. In fact, they may explain why Ruthie's reflections in time isn't easy, but it's often closer to reality than choosing one version over the other. And perhaps that's why Sarah's reported advice continues to provoke discussion. Maybe it reflected the pressures she experienced have resonated with so many people. Real life is rarely as simple as the headlines suggest. A person can leave lasting positive memories while also making choices that change how others see them later. Holding both of those ideas at the same time. If Ruthie Henshall had only shared negative memories, this would be a much easier story to tell. But that's not what happened. In fact, Ruthie has consistently described Sarah as someone who was genuinely welcoming during the years they knew each other. That's what makes her later comments so powerful. Think about it for a moment. Ruthie wasn't looking back on next revelation finally emerges from the shadows. Stay tuned. Public image collides. The story becomes far more complicated than simply deciding whether Sarah Ferguson was good or bad. Royal life itself. The growing gap between private relationships and public reputation would become impossible for Ruthie and many others to ignore. Sarah's warmth toward Ruthie revealed a side the world rarely saw. So why did public opinion turn so sharply against her? Was there more behind the headlines, and could the truth change how her story is remembered when someone who had treated her badly? She wasn't exposing a secret feud or revealing a personal betrayal. Instead, she was talking about someone who had made her feel accepted during what must have been casual at the time. According to Ruthie, Sarah looked at her and simply said, "Get out while you can." Now, if you'd heard that years ago, you probably wouldn't have thought much of it. It could have been a joke, a light-hearted comment, or even those words very differently. Here's why. Ruthie wasn't someone watching the royal family from the outside like the rest of us. She spent around 5 years in a relationship with Prince Edward during the late 1980s and early 1990s, a period when she became familiar with royal gatherings and the personalities behind palace walls. That meant she wasn't judging Sarah Ferguson from newspaper headlines alone. She knew her personally. In fact, Ruthie's early memories of Sarah couldn't have been more positive. She described Sarah as warm, welcoming, and someone who made a genuine effort to include her. Whenever they were together, Sarah's way of poking fun at the pressures of royal life. Nobody stopped to ask what she really meant, and Ruthie herself didn't appear to treat it as a warning. Life moved on. Prince Edward and Ruthie eventually went their separate ways, and that brief conversation faded into the background. But today, people are hearing a forgotten photograph goes viral. A comment that barely attracted attention decades ago suddenly becomes the subject of endless discussion, because people now see it through an entirely different lens. Ruthie's recollection appears to fit that pattern perfectly. Her story hasn't. Sometimes, it simply arrives before people are ready to understand it. Years later, when circumstances change, those same words can suddenly feel far more significant than they ever did before. Think about how often that happens. An old interview resurfaces. Controversies that have surrounded her over the years. People remain fascinated by her story. As a result, Ruthie's reflections arrived at a moment when many were already looking back at the history of the York family from a new perspective. And that's where timing becomes everything. Sometimes, a story isn't ignored because it lacks importance. It changed. Sarah's reported words haven't changed. What has changed is the public's understanding of everything that happened afterward. That's why so many people are revisiting that simple sentence and asking whether it reflected something deep. Admitted that what had emerged about Sarah over the years left her deeply disappointed. She even made it clear that they are no longer in touch. Those comments struck a chord because they felt personal, rather than sensational. People weren't hearing from another royal commentator trying to interpret or claiming to reveal hidden palace secrets. Instead, she spoke candidly about her own experience. She remembered Sarah as welcoming and kind during the years she dated Prince Edward, but she also admitted events from the outside. They were hearing from someone who had actually shared meals, conversations, and family occasions with members of the royal family. That kind of perspective naturally carries a different weight, even when it's based on personal memories rather than dramatic revelations. At the same time, Sarah Ferguson continues to attract public attention whenever her name appears in the news. Whether the discussion centers on her public appearances, her relationship with the royal family, or one another for years. For someone dating a prince, that kind of welcome would have meant a great deal. After all, entering any close-knit family can feel intimidating. Entering Britain's royal family is an entirely different experience. Every interaction carries expectations, traditions, and unspoken rules that most people never have to think about. Having someone already established within the family extend a friendly hand could make an enormous difference. That's exactly why Ruthie's comments have surprised so many people. When she recently reflected on those years, she didn't describe Sarah as cold, hostile, or difficult. Quite the opposite. Ruthie openly acknowledged that Sarah was welcoming and kind to her. Those positive memories haven't disappeared, even though her opinion of Sarah has changed over time. And that's what makes this story far more complicated than a simple disagreement. Ruthie wasn't just reading about the royal family, she was spending time with them. That distinction matters. It's one thing to form an opinion based on newspaper headlines. It's something entirely different to experience people behind it. Ruthie's memories paint a different picture when it comes to Sarah. She has recalled that Sarah always made an effort to include her whenever they were together. Rather than leaving her standing awkwardly on the sidelines, Sarah reportedly brought her into conversations and helped her feel comfortable among relatives who had known closed doors, away from cameras and public appearances. Ruthie found herself attending family occasions, meeting senior royals, and witnessing the atmosphere that outsiders rarely get to see. Although she never officially became part of the royal family, she came close enough to understand the unique pressures that surrounded it. And according to Ruthie, Sarah Ferguson stood out almost immediately. While many people imagine royal gatherings as formal and distant, would make Ruthie's memories feel completely different from reality as the story takes a turn. Keep watching. Everything changed later. Everything changed later. Now here's where the story takes a completely different direction. For years, that conversation between Ruthie Henshall and Sarah Ferguson was nothing more than an old memory. There was no public fallout, no dramatic confrontation, and certainly no suggestion that Ruthie had any reason to question Sarah's character. In fact, if you had asked her back then, she probably would have described Sarah exactly as and remark. It started to sound like something much more revealing. Years later, headlines that forced Ruthie to question everything she once believed about Sarah Ferguson. What changed behind the scenes? Why did their friendship quietly disappear? And what revelation she later did? Warm, welcoming, and someone who went out of her way to make others feel included. But time has a way of changing how people see the past. As the years went by, Sarah Ferguson remained one of the most recognizable figures connected to the royal family. Even after her divorce from Prince Andrew, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Carried these memories for decades. Why are people paying so much attention to them now? After all, the conversation she recalled didn't happen last year. It happened during a completely different chapter of royal history. So why has it suddenly happened since? Suddenly, old conversations don't sound quite so ordinary anymore. That's exactly what has happened here. When Ruthie recently reflected on Sarah Ferguson, she wasn't making wild accusations only become headline news. The answer isn't simply because Ruthie decided to speak. It's because the world around that story has changed. Over the past few years, public interest in the royal family has reached another level. Every interview, every memoir, every documentary, and every previously overlooked story has encouraged people to revisit the past with fresh eyes. Moments that once seemed ordinary are now being examined alongside everything that's been easy to watch. Imagine remembering someone for their warmth and generosity, only to see years of news coverage slowly replace that image with something far more controversial. It's not surprising that disappointment would eventually outweigh admiration. And that's exactly the word. Real life is rarely that straightforward. People can leave positive impressions on those around them,